Welcome everyone to the final day of Hack.Summit. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is a virtual conference for programmers where we have some legends of programmers with us who have been generous enough to give us their time to help raise money for 16 nonprofits in the coding space, many of whom promote diversity among programmers and also promote kind of just generally good social impact in the programming space. They're all coding nonprofits, and we're all helping out to raise money for them. If you like what you're hearing today in our chats, please consider donating. You can do that through the user interface in front of you. And also I want to make one more announcement that earlier this week we created this new initiative called the Hack Pledge, which is a mentorship movement for developers to help mentor each other in 2015. It's a New Year's resolution. You can either give or receive 1 hour of mentoring so that you can pay it forward and help another programmer, or you in your time of need can get help from another programmer. And that's all kicking off in 2015. You can find out about that at hackpledge.org. But without further ado, I have a very special speaker to introduce here today, David Hinnemeyer Hansen, otherwise known as GHH. We're very lucky to have him here today. He's been generous with his time, teleconferencing in all the way from Spain. He's the creator of Ruby on Rails and the co-author of Getting Real, Rework, and Remote, legendary books that I've read. Also designed the first version of Basecamp, which is a SaaS platform, very successful company with a great culture that he's been building for many years. He also recently won his class at 24 Hours of Le Mans and the World Endurance Championship because in his spare time, David is also a race car driver. So David, thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. And I say I'm generous with my time, but it's actually incredibly easy when you just have to basically switch your browser to a Google Hangout. I love this whole concept. I love the concept of having a conference where you can just tune into your browser and don't have to travel for it. So awesome.
Absolutely. Idea. Yeah, so I think what we're just going to do is a fireside chat here between David and myself, as well as the audience. So audience, you have an opportunity here to ask questions of David in the questions and answer category of Crowdcast, which is the technology we're using here to broadcast this fireside chat. And the audience member who asks the question that gets the most votes, as voted by other audience members, will receive basically 1 hour free mentoring with one of the participating speakers after the event is over. You can also answer polls that we're asking in the polls tab of this user interface. So David, I'm just going to start out with a kind of a fun little question here. So obviously you're juggling many things here. You're mentoring other developers in Ruby on Rails. You're contributing to the Rails core as the creator of Ruby on Rails, but you're also juggling this with race car driving. What's it like kind of going from the high speed, kind of high endurance, the whole race car kind of hobby that you have seems like it's very high energy, high adrenaline, but then contrasted with coding is much, much different. So how does it feel to go back and forth between those two?
It's funny because I actually don't see them as that different. I see them as very much alike. The key part for me about driving a race car is not high adrenaline. It's getting into the flow. And I think most programmers are familiar with the flow too, where you get into that zone where everything is just sort of working and time disappears, or it does weird things. You think you've been sitting and programming for 15 minutes and it's actually been 2 hours. And that comes when you're really just engaged in something to the point of not thinking about anything else, right? And you're not thinking about, oh, this is what I need to pick up for dinner later, or I need to do the laundry. When you're fully engaged in programming, you get into this wonderful state of flow. And I think that that's what got me psyched about programming in the first place. And that's what got me psyched about the environments that I've been working on for the past decade or so, that they were just immensely conducive to getting me into this flow zone. And for me, racing is very much the same. When you're in a race car, so your heart rate is probably a little higher than it is when you're sitting and programming. But the main thing is you're focused so intensely at the task at hand, right? Like you're going 200 miles an hour, and if you're thinking about what I should pick up for dinner just before you're breaking into a turn, well, that's probably not going to turn out well for you, right? And the funny thing is, I mean, the consequences perhaps are a little stiffer in racing than they are in programming, but it's the same thing. If you're thinking about all sorts of other things that you need to do or consider when you're programming, instead of just the problem at hand, you're not going to do a great job, right? It's not going to be great code. And the same with the track. It's not going to be a great lap if you're thinking about anything else. So that's really, to me, that book called Flow. I can't pronounce his last name, Mikhail something. You can look that up on Amazon. That really explains where happiness actually is for me. Like the two activities are very much about the same thing. It's about that feeling of happiness, of accomplishment, that you've really focused intensely on something and something great is coming out of it. Either a supremely clear, readable program or fast lap time.
That's really interesting. You know, in my life, I mentioned this yesterday, I practice mindfulness, which is kind of a meditation technique where you're kind of living in the moment, you're focusing, and if there's something that distracts you, you kind of gently return yourself to the present. You know, I'm sure in your life you have a lot of distractions. You've got developers asking you questions all the time. How do you stay focused like that?
I think that's exactly it, right? That you got to find a way, a method, and an approach where you can be free of those distractions. One of the key things that I do is I work remotely, so I don't work in an office. I've tried working in an office, and I found that the distractions you get at the normal office, they're just too great. I couldn't do what it is that I do if I worked in the standard office environment, because I find that these moments of flow, when I actually do work that I at least consider great work, is something I'm proud of, right? It's because of long, sustained, uninterrupted periods of time. It's not getting 15 minutes before the next interruption or the next meeting or whatever else it is that drags you out of that flow, out of the zone. It's getting these long stretches. And the key trick for me has simply just been working from home. I have my home office, and nobody's coming over to my desk to tap me on the shoulder. When I want to engage with somebody, it's on a mostly asynchronous basis, right?
So when your email comes in, does it come in by itself, or do you have to press a button for your email to come in, and for SMS too, and everything else?
I actually do polling a lot. I also turn off the little indicators on the icons. You can actually turn off the indicator on the mail icon so that it doesn't say how much it is. I've been doing that for a while, and what I'm actually doing right now is my icon is so small I can't see the number. So it's just like there's a red dot there. Another hack I've been using is OS X has the notification bar, but if you actually put it on Do Not Disturb for 24 hours a day, it never bugs you. So it's funny because, especially in mobile, a lot of the sort of recent energy has gone into notifications and ways to basically constantly ping you and shoot stuff at you and, oh, you got a new email and it's so urgent. And it's not, right? And most of the time it's not urgent. Whether you answer it now or in 30 minutes is usually just as well. If somebody truly needs your extremely urgent attention, they can give you a call, right? We do this to ourselves. We pull ourselves out of this wonderful phase of flow because we get addicted, right? Like gambling, you're just like, oh, there's a new email. Well, maybe this email is telling me I just won $1 million, so I better check it right now. Most likely it doesn't tell you anything interesting. At best it tells you something interesting, but something interesting you could just as well have read 2 hours from now.
Yeah, I mean, what I hear you saying here is that there's something different between what's urgent in other people's minds and what's important in your mind. And separating urgency from importancy seems to be what you're doing here.
That's huge, right? So most people, when they have a question or something they want from somebody else, they think, oh, that's incredibly important, right? I need to know this right now, when that's extremely rarely the case. You could just do something else for a while. That's also why there's been a lot of sort of bad-mouthing of email and like, oh, we need to do all these synchronous chats instead. Like, that'd be so much better. I don't think it would. I think it has a time and a place, and it's wonderful to be on at the same time. Like right now, right? If this could be an email exchange the two of us is having, but this is more interesting. We're on, we're live, but we don't do this all the time, right? This is not the constant way that the people are working. I love email because I can postpone it. I can say, like, now is the time I'm going to actually check it and go through it.
It's kind of funny because I attempted to fully shut off all push notifications in my life, other than SMS, because sometimes people kind of contact me in an urgent situation out of SMS.
Right.
But you know, Facebook messages, there's a whole culture. I mean, here in San Francisco, my friends here in San Francisco almost expect me to be able to receive push notifications of Facebook messages because they use that medium to coordinate in real time. And if I don't have those push notifications, I'm out of the loop in terms of coordinating last-minute get-togethers and things like that. And so there's this enormous social pressure to turn on those push notifications, which is really annoying.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the reasons I quit Facebook about 3 or 4 years ago, and maybe it's also easier for me. I'm an introvert, and and perhaps bordering on a hermit at times. That's how I protect my productivity and my sanity, to be honest. So I understand why most people can't do that, but that for me has been a big part of why I can juggle the things that I juggle, because I don't do a lot of other stuff, right? I'm very protective of my time and of the things that I choose to sort of involve myself in. I'd rather do a handful of things really well than like 10,000 things very scatterly.
That's very well said, and I think that leads into our next question here. So, you obviously have accomplished a remarkable achievement creating Ruby on Rails, and you did that. I don't know if a lot of people know that. You were only programming for 3 years before you invented Ruby on Rails. Is that correct?
Yep, that's about right.
So, a lot of the folks in the audience kind of have aspirations to, create major open source repos that make an impact. And I'm kind of wondering, like, what makes you tick there? Like, what was your secret to getting so confident so fast? Is this kind of unique to you? Can other people do this? Did you have a mentor? What are some kind of like best practices that you could impart to the audience here?
Sure. I'd say one of the key attributes of that was this oblivion. Like, I just had no idea what it actually entailed to run any of. Rails was my first real open source project. I pushed something out called Sticky, which is this wiki tool. Around the same time I was working on Rails, I pushed it out a little sooner. So I had a little bit of experience from that, but not really, right? Like, I certainly had no idea of how do you manage a project the size of Rails, where we've had, I don't know, at this point, like 4,000 people contribute code to it, and it's been running for over a decade. I don't know if there is anywhere you can really compare or prepare yourself for that kind of thing. I'd say that the main thing that just led me into the whole open source world was, I've been using open source software. So I think that's a great start, right? If you want to get involved with open source, use a lot of open source software, because that gives you a very good perspective of what it is to actually be a user of a piece of software. As a side note, I think some of the worst companies in the world are started by people who were never employees. If you've actually never worked under somebody else, it's terribly difficult to put yourself in their shoes. And you tend up being kind of an asshole as a manager and as a business owner, if that's the case. Yeah, I've worked under people who did that. Yeah, exactly. I worked at a couple of companies where that was the case, right? Like, it was obvious that these people hadn't been employees, or at least they'd forgotten how that was. So I think the same thing is true of open source. To be a good open source contributor, you have to be a good open source user. Because then you kind of just understand the frustrations and so on. But then the second thing I'd say right after that is you got to create something for yourself. At least, again, I'm talking about my learned experience. So I mean, there very well be other paths. But for me, the important thing was I wanted to create something that I wanted, right? I'm sure there are altruistic people who just want to help other people and they want to figure out what their problems are and so on. That was never my deal. My deal was, hey, I want to build a web application in Ruby. Oh, there's no good ORM in Ruby. Oh, there's not a good implementation of the action control pattern, something like that, right? So I just said, well, if I want to use Ruby, I guess I have to build it myself. So a lot of it was just born out of necessity. It wasn't, oh, let me sit down and plan how I can have world domination through a web framework, right? It was strictly just from I want this myself. If I build it and I enjoy it, well, I mean, I've been using open source software. I should open source it. Other people will enjoy it. And if they like it and they run into some of their problems, then they'll contribute their solutions to it and we can share. Like, that's what's really so magical to me, and what I really get out of open source is that I get to like share solutions. It's like trading cards, right? Like, oh, you have that card? I really like that. Here, I'll give you this card for it. You give me that card, and we're both better off, right? Open source, I give you this patch, you give me that patch, and now we have a commons that's richer. And it's just such an amazing thing that we can coordinate and work together in that way where we're both better off, and the world is better off too. Because we just traded our patches, then everyone else basically essentially did that trade too, or they at least benefited from that trade. I mean, it just seems like such a breakthrough of humanity.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's just incredible. I mean, I remember when and this is kind of interesting because I remember 10, 15 years ago, back when there was the Java space, there was a huge amount of buzz around JBoss as the application server that kind of started the whole idea of professional open source, where they open sourced this repository, and then Mark Fleury and his team made an enormously successful business based on JBoss that made a lot of people a lot of money. And you chose not to take that path with Ruby on Rails. You decided not to make an enterprise version of Rails. Why was that?
In part because I saw what happened to the Java space. Right? So I was an observer of that at the time. And they were absolutely trendsetters on a lot of things at that time. If you wanted to sort of learn how to run open source and look at frameworks, Java was doing a lot of interesting work back then in the early 2000s. I mean, not that it's not interesting work now, but it was more like that was where it was happening. And I was seeing that a lot of the software that came out of it had this very enterprisey feel to it. It had the feel to it as though it was built by consultants to need consultants, right? If you wanted to use, and now I'm being harsh and perhaps a bit unfair, but if you wanted to use JBoss, you kind of needed a support contract, right? Because the software was pretty fucking complicated to use. And that was true of a lot of these packages that had professional services attached to it. That I'm a big believer in sort of systems theory and reinforcement and looking at the flows. And if you look at something like a professional services company around open source, right? Like you put out a piece of software, okay, it has to be good enough that people want to use it. But if it's actually so good that people can just use it, they don't need you. That's a poor business. If you put out a piece of software that's interesting and appealing enough to get people in, but then kind of complicated enough that you'd like to have consultants help you understand it or change it or update it, then there's a great business for consultants around it. That was never what I was interested in. First of all, I'm not interested in tools for their own sake. Like I built Ruby on Rails because I wanted to build Basecamp. Like that was the point. Basecamp was the point. Ruby on Rails wasn't the point, right? That was how I got there. And sort of, okay, over the years I fell in love with the tool building as well, but always as a means to an end. I'm very suspicious about people who are just tool builders, and that's their final destination, is to simply build the tools. I'm not saying people can't make great tools that way. I'm just saying I'm suspicious about it. I've seen plenty of examples, especially in the Java space, of that leading down to a path of suffering and misery.
Mm-hmm. Makes a lot of sense. Now, one more question for me before we go to the audience here.
Sure.
So there's a lot of developers in the audience that have made open source contributions. We polled this yesterday. I think around 60% of our audience has either made an open source contribution or is planning to do that this year. And some of them may be thinking about building a career based on open source. Do you have any advice for them on best practices for building a career based on open source?
Well, I can tell you about how basically I built a career on open source, you could say, and a lot of the programmers we have working at Basecamp build a career on open source, is that they used open source to basically make a name for themselves to some extent. Like certainly my involvement with Ruby on Rails has helped Basecamp, my company, right? And certainly the involvement that a lot of the programmers we have working at Basecamp has helped them was like they got on my radar or they got on the company's radar because they had contributed to open source. And then they landed I hope, a great job with Basecamp, and that's how they sort of got something out of it. I have very mixed feelings about, again, the full-time tool building approach, right? So if you want to basically, I just want to build open source software all day long. I mean, again, not saying it can't happen. There are plenty of examples of like the guy behind Redis, MySQL, and so on, were great tool builders. There's nothing, they wanted to build tools. That was wonderful and it worked out well. I think there are other examples where it doesn't necessarily work out as well, right? And to some extent, I also think it's easy to lose contact with Earth, what Joe Spolsky called architecture astronauts. They're very common in the tool builder space. Once you're disconnected from the real world applications that either people are working on or preferably you're working on, it's easy to get sucked into this void of just working on the tools for their own sakes or optimizing for README and manual examples, and they're all pretty, and then people do actual code, and it's like, fuck, why is this just hard? Why doesn't this work? And the reason I say this is because I've spent 10 years sort of sometimes doing that, right? I'd get some idea for Rails, and they go, oh man, that'd be really cool. and I'd sit down and implement it, and it looked great in the example, and be like, oh man, this is going to be wonderful. A few times I even shipped it, and then I tried to actually use it in my application afterward, and like, oh shit, this is all wrong, right? When
what you're basically saying here is to apply a lean startup customer development iterative cycle to building features in open source, in that you actually need to be solving a problem that people have, rather than something.
Yeah, and I think that even more than that is that you have to be. It's so hard to do that if it's not your own problem. If you're not solving your own real, not imaginary problem, if you just have a theory of how things should work and you're not sort of smashing that against the practice of the real world, the real application you're working on, it's just almost impossible, I find it, to come up with great stuff. All the main thing I'm interested in for Rails is API design, right? Having the API feel great, having it be able to turn out beautiful code under the constraints of the real world. It's often very easy to make a beautiful piece of code if it doesn't actually have to do anything interesting. If it has to do something interesting, it has to do something that serves the purpose of a real application. It's so much harder, but also so much more rewarding. And for me, I can only get there if I'm actually building tools to solve the immediate problems I have right now. I can't be solving imaginary problems. I can't be solving other people's problems. I can't be solving problems I think I will have in 3 months. It has to be I'm solving a problem I have right now. Basically, all my contributions to Rails stem from that source.
And I think your comments here are also echoed by other speakers. Yesterday we had Salil Deshpande as a speaker, and Salil is an investor in open source. And his biggest piece of advice, there's an audience member who asked a question. They were 14 years old. How can they start a business? And Salil's advice was fall in love with the problem.
Right.
Pretty much exactly what you're saying here. So I love it.
Yep. Let me tend to that just a little bit. I think that's a beautiful way of putting it, fall in love with the problem. I will say a lot of tool builders fall in love with a problem. It just happens to be an imaginary one. And that doesn't necessarily lead you down to a path of great open source software, but I think that's a minor nit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of friends here in San Francisco that have thought about starting businesses, and they'll sit around, they'll think of startup ideas, and they'll spend a lot of time doing that. But those may be imaginary problems, right? Those are not necessarily real problems in the real world.
Yep, and I guess that sometimes works out. I think a lot of times it also doesn't.
Yeah.
But again, it's fair enough also to have just a sort of vague idea of where you want to be, or have some role models if I kind of want to emulate that. I did that myself. I remember seeing Kent Beck on stage at JAO 2003 in Aarhus, Denmark. And I saw him sort of give this presentation on extreme programming, and I thought, man, that's cool. Not even just, man, that's cool. Man, Kent is cool, right? He has such a great delivery. It's such a great story. The thought framework he was presenting was just so appealing. I thought, I want to do that. Like, that'd be great to do that. So that became an inspiration for me later to think, oh, I'd like to give tech presentations about interesting stuff and be as cool as Kent. And I think that's fair enough to have that as a sort of an aspiration, even though it's not that tangible, because I didn't know what I wanted to say then, right? So in 2003, I just started working on Ruby on Rails. So okay, maybe I could talk about that, but that wasn't even so direct in my mind. So sometimes we have these other influences on taking us down certain paths that are just like, oh, I'd like to emulate that, which is also completely fair.
It's so funny that you say that, because we actually had Kent Beck on earlier this week, and he did a fantastic job. And it's really interesting, because I believe that back in May, you actually had a Google Hangout with Kent Beck and Martin Fowler talking about test-driven development. So it must have been thrilling, kind of coming full circle to the idol that you kind of looked up to when you first started off.
It was scary in many ways. Both Kent and Martin were part of my original cast of programming heroes. So to not only be talking to them on a topic, but especially in Kent's case, actively debating him harshly from a perspective that was pushing back against at least some caricatures of his ideas. That was daunting, but a thrilling experience nonetheless. I'm so in debt in both to Martin Fowler's work and Kent Beck and a lot of other people from that same era really informed my view of the world.
That's great. All right, let's go ahead and toss it over to the audience. So the number one audience member question, Andres Root, congratulations, you're going to be winning that 1 hour free mentoring as part of Hack Pledge. Andres's question is, Twitter changed Ruby on Rails for Scala, among others. What do you think is the reason for that? What's wrong with Ruby on Rails in those cases?
Again, it's a very common question. It's completely fair. There's a lot of sort of angles of that. Let me just tackle a couple of them. The first thing I'll say is, whenever you build any kind of system that grows to Twitter scale, you will rewrite everything. Like, I don't care what you started in, you will rewrite everything. And that's not an original thought. Basically, anyone who's worked on a major system like that has gone through that. So the original choice of platform share a completely different problem space from the subsequent choice of platform once you're at Twitter scale. The choice of platform in Twitter's early days was figuring out what the hell is Twitter, right? We have a tiny team, we have to build a compelling product, we have to figure out what the problem is. We need something that's easily changeable, malleable, something where we can add and remove features in great haste, and we're willing to sacrifice other things for it. We're willing to sacrifice peak performance of how this system is going to operate once you have 200 million people use it every day, right? We're not going to worry about that right now. And not worrying about that right now is what allows you to worry about the things that will get you to there eventually, right? So it's very similar to, I find, business advice sometimes. So people will look at Jack Welch, like the former CEO of GM, and they're like, oh, he wrote a business book. I'm just starting a business. I should read what Jack Welch has to say about business. He managed 200,000 people. I'm sure he will have very insightful things to say about my 3-person startup. You can see where this is going. No, he won't. He'll have interesting things to say about how you sort of, once you get to his scale, deal with his problems. It's very likely that he will have at very least, a romanticized image of what it was to be 3 people in the garage. And in any case, the patterns, the practices, and the thought framework to deal with the problem of creating an interesting company with 3 people is completely different from running a global enterprise the size of GM. Same with technology. Rails is optimized not for what happens when you have 200 million users. It just isn't. It can't. No piece of technology can stretch from fantastic to prototype, fast iterations, all that stuff, to, oh, works phenomenally well for 200 million people. First of all, nothing works phenomenally well. Nothing off the shelf works phenomenally for 200 million people. Everyone at the Twitter, Facebook, whatever, Google scale, they built their own stuff, right? They might build on top of something, but usually that's where new sort of hyper internet scale stuff comes out of. It just so happens to be, of course, that like they are the moonshots of technology. The 99.99999% of applications in the world will never, ever, ever have to worry about the problems of Twitter, Facebook, and Google, right? They dream they will, right? So that's the appeal. That's the appeal of looking at technology used by the giants, is that you think that you too will be running Google. And I better be making the preparations now for my billionaire lifestyle, right? And it's similar to that joke of Americans, poor Americans, what do they think about themselves? Oh, they think they're just temporarily embarrassed millionaires. A lot of technologists think that they're just temporarily embarrassed Googles. They're just not. They're not going to run into these problems, but they're endlessly fascinated with trying to decipher the secret of Google by looking at the technology stack that they now use. And it's just not relevant, right? So I think it's a great success story for Ruby on Rails. Could you imagine anything better than Ruby on Rails used to get Twitter to the point where they could afford to basically rewrite the entire system in something so scalable, yet so unchangeable that they were unable to introduce new features for what now, 5 years? But then they were able to scale to 200 million people, right? So they're different ends of the spectrum. And it's a mirage to think that any technology is going to span the whole thing. Rails admits upfront and on the label on the box that this will only work for the 5 nines of developers, right? It'll only work for the 99.9999 developers. If you're in that last 0.01%, don't use Rails, use something else.
Plus, one could argue that if you're fortunate enough to be in that position, where your company grows to that point, and you have that level of scale, you will have the resources to do any rewrites needed at that point.
Of course. And everyone does. Again, that's a point that even if you thought that you could pick the perfect technology for hyperscale in the end, you still will do the rewrite. Because you know what? The key problem most of the time, in many of the cases, is not execution speed of your platform, it's your algorithm. Your algorithm is wrong. Your architecture is wrong. And if you took all the lessons that Twitter now have of running the system at the scale that they now do and applied that in their original environment, they'd be orders of magnitude closer to the level of performance they now enjoy than they were with their original system. Because the original system just, it didn't know what it wanted to be. And that's the truth of all systems, right? All systems start out with like, we're fumbling in the dark, we're trying to figure out what to do. We don't know where the hotspots are going to be. Unless you've built the exact same system before, and in that case, wait, what are you doing? Like, why are you building it again? Just use the old system.
And I would argue that even for most projects, when they're just getting started out, the bottleneck not only isn't speed in that sense, but it also could be just developers' time being the bottleneck. Just not having enough time to write stuff from scratch. And the idea of having gems available for you and using convention over configuration and getting up and running in record time. You know, the number one problem we have right now in San Francisco, the problem we're trying to solve with Hack Pledge, with uniting these developers and improving the productivity gap, is that there's a $500 billion shortfall in wages projected between now and 2020 in unfilled jobs for programmers that are qualified.
Yes.
And you have helped solve that problem with Rails, I believe.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's part of what we're trying to do, and it's not only just from a productivity perspective. It's just as much from an approachability and a happiness perspective, because you might very well have a lot of well-trained programmers, but if they hate the environment they work in so much that they quit, you're also no further ahead. I've talked to tons of programmers who were like, whatever environment I was using before, I didn't enjoy myself. I didn't think it was fun being a programmer. I was actively thinking about switching careers. And then they found something that they actually did enjoy, right? If you're a programmer and you have to sit 8 hours a day, let's say 4 hours a day, the other 4 are meetings and interruptions. If you have to sit 4 hours a day and work on something, it damn well better be sort of an interesting environment, right? If it's a depressing, basically cubicle, gray walls sense of a technology space, a lot of people are not going to think, oh, this is wonderful, I want to do this for the rest of my life. They're going to drop out and they're going to do something else. And then on the approachability perspective, if it takes 2 days to set up your framework because you have to configure all the XML before you can even say hello world, well, there's probably going to be a lot of people who are turned off by that, right? Versus with something like Rails, if you can get up and running and basically just make the basic CRUD application that is just there to give you a sense of victory, you're much more likely to continue. But I think that the larger point is true in this sense that the bottleneck, and I mean, the bottleneck when I started was programmer productivity. It wasn't for a very large class of problems. It wasn't how quickly can this execute on a CPU, right? Like speed wasn't the main issue. And to this day, it remains so, just much more so. Like computers have gotten endlessly faster since 10 years ago, right? They've gotten so much cheaper. And it was funny, even when I started, Ruby, let's take Ruby. Ruby was a ton slower back then. CPUs were far slower. They were much more expensive. And yet it was still a great trade. Like, how much better is the trade today? It got so much better, right? And it expanded the space of how long it stays good. So let's take just Basecamp for an example, right? So we've had, I don't know, 15, 20 million people use the system. We have a company of 45 people, multi-million-dollar revenues, blah, 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 blah. Rails is still a fantastic fit, right? It wasn't like we outgrew that. And most people will never outgrow it. Most people will never outgrow sort of the framework for the 99. Like, so few people will end up in that 1% bucket where they actually do need the rewrite, where they do need this sort of fantastically optimized system. And again, some people will because they have a cost model that perhaps requires them that they'll make so little per customer that it needs to be extremely frugal. But for the most part, I think it's just this infatuation of efficiency that programmers have that is outdated and is counterproductive, but it's also counterintuitive. Because I think most programmers just intuitively feel like, oh, this has to be as optimized and as clean as it can. So if I'm wasting time writing in a slower language like Ruby, like it feels like something is, like it's hurting me, right? And you can see this even within programming cultures. Just look at the framework comparisons of Hello World benchmarks. It blows my mind how attractive it is for people to look at Hello benchmarks. When you just look, who are writing these Hello World applications? Nobody is. But they're all just so infatuated. Oh, did you see this new framework? It's got like 15% more requests a second done on the Hello World bench, and they're talking as though that meant anything. And it just blows my mind of people being unable to connect the things that have real value with these sort of mirages. But anyway.
So speaking of other languages, obviously there here in Silicon Valley and other parts in the world, there's kind of a lot of hype around the mean stack and JavaScript, and a lot of this stems from the fact that there's a huge number of experienced JavaScript programmers who program in the web browser today as part of HTML and CSS, the lowest common denominator here for programmers being JavaScript, and that everyone has to know some JavaScript to kind of build web applications. And there's this huge temptation for those client-side programmers to say, hey, I can use this technology, the skills that I already have, and now program on Node.js on the server. And now there's another kind of layer on top of that people are building with isomorphic applications such as Meteor.js, which is extending that even further. Do you see this as a threat to Rails? Do you think that Rails could one day be obsoleted by this ecosystem?
So first of all, I just want to reject the notion that in technology anything wins. Like it's such a great story, right? Like it's such a great story that there's going to be this, and even that is a fucking cliche, but there's going to be this silver bullet that obsoletes all these environments that we have, right? Like it's kind of thinking of the world. We have all these wonderful different countries and cultures, and then we're just going to have one nation, one passport, one currency, one language to rule it all. I think not only is that fantastically naive, I think it's also fantastically depressing. Like the wonders of the world is the diversity we have. It's not to turn everything into the same gray goop. And as it comes to sort of the other notion of like, oh well, there's so many people who already know JavaScript, like so that's going to win by that. Like I've heard that argument so many times before. When I got started with Ruby, I turned up at a Ruby conference in the US. I think it was the third Ruby conference. I think we were 40 people there. When I asked how many people do this professionally, we were 2 that raised our hands. Everyone else were just there. Like Ruby was a hobby for them. That wasn't fucking 1945. That was 2003 or 2004, I think. Right? It was very recent history, and the Ruby community did not exist as a professional community. And look at it today, right? So back then we were fighting, look, everyone knows Java. Like Java is going to be the thing that rules everything, or everyone knows already PHP. So what? You don't need everyone. Like, what is this community where you're going to involve everyone under the same tent? It doesn't work. People splinter off anyway. Like the fact is that Rails and the Ruby community already has an insanely large tent. Right? We have hundreds of thousands of people using Ruby and Rails, and it's fine. Like, is that going to be materially better because there's a million more? No. There's a good chance it won't even scale to that. Most communities actually have a tendency to break down once they reach that kind of scale. So I think from just a cultural perspective, I found the idea that we're going to have the one language to rule it all repulsive and sort of counterproductive and utterly unrealistic. But it's funny because the narrative keeps popping up, even though we've tried this narrative for so many times, right? The second part of it, I'd say, is that this is why I love the web. In the history of computer programming and platforms, it usually was such that you would have the vendor and they would dictate the tool chain. So if you're going to make an iOS app, well, you're probably going to use the Apple tool chain. If you're going to make something for Windows Phone, like you probably got to use the Microsoft stack, right? So for a large number of environments, you have this dictate. The web is this fantastic equalizer. Can you push out HTML? Can you put strings together? Wonderful. Your technology can now serve the World Wide Web, right? So that's why we get this amazing diversity of the ecosystem, is because as long as you can produce text, you're on an even field. Like, a user does not give two hoots about whether a website is written in Ruby or in Python or in Node.js, as long as it, most importantly, delivers value. Secondly, hopefully it's kind of fast and so forth. And there's so many languages that can do that. So you don't have this impediment where in the old days, if you wanted to make a native app and make it feel like it was native, you had to use the official toolchain. So you were locked into that. The web freezes from all this. Everyone can make a native app. So I find it just so much less compelling to talk about this one language, on the web, on top of all these other issues. But
maybe another way to kind of phrase this then would be, if you were starting out, let's say there's a kind of a team within a company or a startup, and they have to choose between Rails and the main stack today. What kind of decision-making process would you advise they go through? What are some of the trade-offs that you see between the two to help them make that decision?
I think it's a hard thing to boil down to a sort of a feature list, right? Because that's often how you sort of like, oh, well, can it do this? Well, the fact of the matter is that everything can do everything. So as we just talked about, as long as you can put strings together, your technology can serve the World Wide Web. So is it the right thing for you? That's where it gets far more interesting. And I think we have a long history of informing that decision. If you look at languages like Python and Ruby, they occupy very similar space and has for a very long time. Has one language killed the other language? No. There's still Ruby developers, there's still Python developers. Why? Because for some people, Ruby as a language just really appealed to them. Like, it fit their brain, right? It fit their way of thinking. The ethos of the community and the approach to how they do things, it really fit them. In Python, different approach. Even though we're solving the same problem with very similar technologies, albeit wrapped in slightly different syntax and with some different ideas, it developed its own community. I think the same thing is true with JavaScript. When I look at JavaScript code, I see something distinctly different from what I see when I look at Ruby code. And mostly, for me, it's not an upside I'm looking at, but I also understand that people do look at it as an upside, right? Like, you look at anything else in the world, and you can have two people look at, like for me, languages, for example. German, to me, is a very functional, not in a computer sense, but functional language, but it's very ugly. Like, I wouldn't want to speak German for the rest of my life, and I'm sure I'm upsetting a lot of Germans right now, which is actually even funny because Danish, actually, let's take Danish, that's a better example because I can offend far less people. Danish is not a very pretty language. It just isn't. And I'm a Dane, right? It's not a beautiful language. If I had to speak one language till the end of my days, if it had to be Danish, I'd feel a little sad about that. I find English to be a much prettier language. I find French, Italian, even Spanish to be more beautiful languages. And I think the same is true for programming. We have different things that just appeal to us on different emotional levels. Then, of course, there is a functional comparison, right? So you have the emotional level, and you have like what sort of appeals to you on a gut beauty basis, and that's one often overlooked, I feel, but important part of the discussion. Then there's the other discussion, which is what does it do, and how quickly does it do it, and can it do the things that we do? I feel we're in a very comfortable position. So with Ruby and Rails, not only have we had around 10 years sort of to build up very honed package. It's very complete at this point. And while it's still moving too fast for some people, we still have developers who are working on Rails 2.3 apps, even though Rails 2.3 came out in 2009, even before Node.js took off. We have a lot more stability, and I think there's some mix of that, right? So if you look at, like, again, Perl and Python and Ruby, they all have different tolerances as community for the rate of change. And Ruby sits in one area where, compared, I think, to perhaps the Python community, we have a pretty aggressive acceptance for the rate of change, right? Like putting out new versions of the languages and putting out new versions of Ruby. Even just look at the two major frameworks, right? Django in Python It's only a little younger than Ruby, and it's at version, I think, 1.7. Just looking at the version number alone, nothing else. Rails, we're pushing 5.0 soon. So that tells you just a little bit about how do you value stability versus sort of chasing new things. Then if you compare Ruby to the JavaScript world, it looks like we're fucking old men sitting on the porch, right?
Yeah,
like
it's so funny
stability, everything else. Like the amount of churn that you have in the JavaScript community is staggering. And I say that as somebody who generally prefer a higher level of churn to get some sort of newer benefits out of it, and I'm exhausted just looking at fucking the headlines that go by. Obviously, at some time that's gonna slow down, but at present stage, the amount of ridicule I've seen on Hacker News threads where somebody says, "Oh, I'd like to use this framework," and somebody chimes in like, "Dude, what are you talking about? Like that was cool like 5 months ago." I was like, Jesus, all right. I even feel like I'm getting old when that's the level of discussion that we have. But in any case, I think it boils down to give it a try, build something, do a spike in either, do a real spike. Just spend a week. Like you're going to boil your choices down to not everything in the world. You're going to have to look at a couple of things. If you want to look at, let's say, Django, Rails, and Node.js, you can certainly afford for your team to spend a week in each having a feel for it. Like, does it feel like it fits my culture, my domain, my rate of change, and all these things? And pick from there. It's looking to other people. It's kind of like asking, like, in some ways, and I understand it's not the whole answer. It's like, oh, which ice cream should I have? Like, should I have vanilla, chocolate, or pistachio, right? How am I going to tell you that? Fucking just taste each, and then figure out what works for you. Like, there's such a sense of like, oh shit, this is going to be so disastrous if I pick the wrong thing. No, it's not. All these environments are good enough. Like, if you pick Node.js, even if you fucking pick PHP, do you know what? You can still build a great web application that people are going to love, and they're not going to hate it because you picked one or the other. So there's this unreasonable fear that people are going to pick the wrong thing. Oh my God, what if I pick Rails and like 5 months later I find out that that's completely outdated? What are you talking about? It's not going to happen. That's not how this shit works. People are still programming COBOL. Okay, don't pick COBOL for your new app, but these things just it's a false sense of just how quickly things do change. They don't change that quickly. And you building your app in X, even if X in 5 years turns out that's not the hottest thing anymore, it's not the end of the world. Chances are, if you actually were successful with X, you've already rewritten the app 3 times.
Makes sense. Yeah, actually, in my own side projects a couple years ago, I had to make that choice between Rails and the main stack. I actually went with Rails because in my personal life, my risk tolerance is that I'd like to have a system that is a little bit more fully baked. At the time, the main stack was very new, and a lot of the node libraries didn't interoperate with each other as well as they will be in the years coming forward. There wasn't really necessarily a winner and a loser yet in each category of gems, quote unquote, in the node space.
Right.
And I really wanted that interoperability to work. But I was also scared because I was scared, am I missing out on the latest trend? But I also didn't really want to program in JavaScript because I don't like the JavaScript language. I think Ruby's a lot more elegant than JavaScript. But at the same time, do I necessarily want to be investing in a skill set and a technology that maybe in the future might change? And so one of the other interesting points that some other folks have kind of told me, and I'm kind of curious to get your opinion on this, is there are a lot of developers that want to work on whatever the latest thing is. And so from a recruiting perspective, some have made the argument that going with the mean stack can actually help recruiting in the sense that it causes adverse selection and self-selection for developers that want to work on whatever the latest and greatest technology is. What do you think of that argument?
I used that argument 10 years ago, right? So all these arguments that apply, and all the counter-arguments applied to Rails 10 years ago, right? When Rails first came on the scene, nobody knew Ruby, so you had to learn Ruby. Is this the right thing to invest in? We weren't as, we never really, in Ruby, things turned out a little different on the framework level. There were a clearer front runner earlier. Rails, I think, is unique in that sense, that we didn't have as much, there was competition, there were other Ruby frameworks, but we very early took a very clear lead, and Ruby and Rails came very closely associated from the get-go. Most other languages have a much broader proliferation. So even if you choose to say use Python, a PHP, or a Node, what people then use from there is usually often much more spread out, right? That you have a larger group of different kind of frameworks that it tracks. Where we had, I think it was an advantage, it worked to an advantage for us, is that Ruby and Rails came so closely linked that if you picked Ruby, you picked Rails for the large case. Of course, again, there were competitors, blah, blah, blah. So that just gave us all the mind space, right? Everyone who is in Ruby, I dare to say, if they worked in Ruby and they worked on web applications, they've used Rails. There's going to be outliers, but as a general case, that's true. That hasn't been true necessarily in environments since, or in other environments, because there was this larger diffusion of approaches, right? But I think to the larger point is so you said, I like the stability, I like the integration. So basically, I like the community values of Ruby. Like that was what you're saying, and I like the feel
I also like
of the
the elegance of the language. I think the language.
Exactly. So you basically had both, right? Like those are the two main criteria I would pick something on. And then you had the third thing, which was the, I think, irrational fear that I'm picking the wrong thing, right? To me, that's a little bit about like walking around worrying about, shit, am I going to get eaten by a shark today? Like, it could fucking happen. I could walk somewhere and a shark could have fallen out of the sky and I could get eaten by that. Or let's say I get struck by lightning, right? I could get struck by lightning. Maybe I just shouldn't go outside today. Maybe I shouldn't go down to the cafe and have lunch, even though I prefer their sandwiches. I'm just going to make a shittier sandwich at home because I fucking don't want to get struck by lightning, right? It just doesn't play out like that. Like, okay, there's going to be some things that start up and like there's 5 people using it, and there's a fair chance that that's not going to go anywhere. At this point, Rails has so many people using it. Rails is going to live forever, in the same sense that Java and struts is going to live forever. So there will forever be apps running on Rails. Once you reach critical mass, these things just don't go away anymore. So the fear that like you've wasted your skills or whatever, they're irrational in my perspective. And they're also irrational from the sense that like, what's the worst thing that can happen? The worst thing that can happen is that you've learned another programming language, you learned another paradigm, you learned another set of sensibilities. Are you going to be worse off as a programmer if you have to take those skills and then also learn something else? Of course you're not. You're going to be better off, right? You're going to take all that knowledge and you're going to bring it to whatever language you end up in eventually. Like, was I worse off because I learned Java? Was I worse off because I learned PHP? No. There were massive, huge influences on me in finally finding my place in the world with Ruby and Rails, right? I'd been a much worse programmer if I hadn't gone through those learning phases. So I'm just saying that as a way of sort of dissipating some of the fear there is about making the wrong choice. If you're choosing between major secure ecosystems and framework combinations, then you're not going to pick the wrong thing, right? I will caveat that with saying that has been true of the past that I've observed. The current rate of change in the JavaScript framework world might not hold entirely true for that, but I generally say that it would.
It's very well said, thanks. Okay, let's go toss it back to the audience here. Martin Dilling. So his question is, with 190 votes, massive votes for this question, what are the alternatives to test-driven development if test-driven development is dead? So maybe a little bit of background here, David, on your statements back at RailsConf.
Yep, so at RailsConf I was talking about TDD, and TDD stands for test-driven development. And I was talking about a perception of test-driven development as meaning you have to write your tests before you write your code. You have to see a failing test before you're allowed to write production code and then get a passing test. And for a while, I bought into that. Thought it was a very compelling framework of thought. And then I thought it was a very compelling theory. Then I applied the theory, as with many things, to the realities of working. And I found it lacking. And in the beginning, I simply just questioned my own implementation of the faith, my own lack of faith. Oh, this is just because I'm not doing it right. Like if I have more faith and if I just do it with greater vigor, it'll turn out great. And then in the end, I decided, no, do you know what? Maybe this just isn't just me. Maybe TDD as the way of driving all forms of development is just not the right choice. So I started pushing back against that. Some people saw that as a pushback. Of course, you boil everything down to what fits in the tweet, and it's like, oh, David says don't test anymore. No, that's not what I said at all. Being involved with TDD taught me the values of automated regression testing, which I'm still a huge believer in. What I feel is that the way of driving your architecture by writing your tests first is sometimes it's good. I find that sometimes to mean rarely. Sometimes it's ambivalent, it doesn't matter, you could write it before or after. I find that some of the times. And sometimes, and that's what I was really reacting to, was that I think it turns out worse, that you are worse off by driving your architecture, by writing your tests off, that it leads to more complicated, less clear designs than if you had not written your tests first. And that really led me to revisit, hey, do you know what? Maybe we shouldn't tell people that TDD is the way to write all code, right? And maybe it's a more limited sort of technique, or maybe it's more of an allegory to, like, this is a stylized, idealized form of development that you don't actually do in real life a lot of the time. But anyway, the bottom line is you should still be writing your tests. Writing them first is not imperative to creating good software. And oftentimes, I find creating good software comes from focusing on the clarity, looking at your sort of programming stuff from a perspective of reading the API, treating software development as writing rather than this pass or fail pass phase.
Great, makes sense. Okay, so we only have a couple more minutes here. I just want to give you the opportunity to kind of, there's a lot of developers in the audience that are aspiring in their careers. Some of them are just getting started. Do you have any kind of general words of wisdom for the audience in general in terms of a best practice that you've learned, both maybe not even as a programmer, but maybe as a human being, in terms of what makes someone into a great developer, a great human being that you would like to collaborate with going forward, and that you've seen in other developers?
Man, that's a tough question. How do you boil down the meaning of life into a tweet? But I'll take it anyway. So I think for me, and I'll play it off the TDD thing. For me, great development at the level of development that I do, which is not writing video device drivers or databases or whatever, but writing information technology systems, is to treat programming like writing, to focus and care for it as that kind of craft, as though every piece of code you write down is a draft, not just from a perspective of like, oh, it doesn't work yet, it's a broken draft, but a draft even from the perspective of clarity and beauty. Can you hone this piece of code as though it was a piece of prose? Can you write it better? Can you write it clearer? Can you not reach for sort of patterns and sophisticated techniques before you've just written it better? And sorry, I have Campfire running in the background, so my headphones, I'm getting like all the play sounds here, which is completely pulling me out of my train of thought. I just quit that. Anyway, treating programming like writing, I'd say that's a great way to get started. And then there's all this stuff that spills out of that, which is how do you become a great writer? You read a lot and you write a lot. And I feel like people don't always do the reading part. So when I got started with Ruby, I read through the entire standard library. How could I do that? Because it was all written in Ruby and I could understand it. Today, with the availability of GitHub and gems and so on, it's incredibly easy to expose yourself to a huge body of written software and writing, and then reading that, internalizing, not so much just to figure out like, oh, this is how I should work on things, or this is how I want to write, but just as much as to figure out like, oh, this is what I don't want to do. It's much easier to critique other people's code than it is to critique your own. So by looking at patterns of use in other people's code, you can much more easily say, oh, geez, that's stupid, I don't want to do that. And anyway, it develops your eye for what is good software. And I find that that's true in many other areas of life and pursuit. Certainly when it comes to hobbies, as we were talking about earlier, two of my hobbies, race car driving and photography, are both about developing an eye. They're both about seeing things that people you don't just automatically see. I remember one example I used in the presentation was when I first got started in photography, I didn't know what white balance was. There's some pictures that looked off, and I didn't know because their white balance was off, right? Once you develop your eyes so that you can see that, oh, this has a green tint, or oh, this has a yellow tint, and you can adjust for that, you become a better photographer. And I think just being mindful about these things, like here are the things that I'm observing, training my eye in all aspects of life, both in terms of being good at your hobbies, but also in terms of being a kind, caring human being that develops an eye for inequality, or develops an eye for diversity, or develops an eye just for kindness and knowledge in general, is a very worthwhile pursuit. And when you treat it as such, I feel like you also just take it more seriously, and it's more mindful, which is sort of how we started the conversation. So.
Well said, David. David, I want to thank you so much. Incredible fireside chat we had here. I learned a lot. And your final words of wisdom were very inspiring to me, as well as the audience. The chat's going crazy here. Everyone's just really, really a huge fan of you and your work, and I have a lot to thank you for. You know, I've used Rails on so many projects now. It's made a big impact on my life. So thank you.
Thanks. I appreciate it, and thanks to everyone else who tuned in for that. Whether you are a fan of the work that I've done or not, I think there cannot be order in the universe unless you both have people who strongly like your work and strongly dislike it. So I welcome both sides of that spectrum.
Great. So if you liked what David had to say here today, please consider making a contribution to one of the 16 nonprofits in the coding space. I've gone ahead and focused everyone to there right now. These help important issues like diversity among programmers. Only 2% of open source contributions today are made by women. A lot of the nonprofits are helping to solve that problem. There's a lot of other important initiatives and causes that these nonprofits are helping to solve. So I really appreciate any generosity you guys can give in that area. David, I want to thank you so much again for being here. It was a pleasure and a thrill to have you. You're kind of like my Kent Beck here. So I was nervous the whole time, just like you were with Kent Beck.
See, no need to be, which I learned with Kent as well. And thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this form of talking, much more so actually than prepared presentations. So great questions, both from you and from the audience, and thanks so much for having me.
Great. We'll be right back, guys. Our next speaker, Trisha G, is going to give an in-depth tutorial on programming a web stack, and I hope you guys are here to see it. It's going to be a great tutorial. David, thanks again.